April 24th, 1945. Lübeck. At 1 in the morning, Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross sits across from Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, and hears something that should have been impossible. Himmler says Adolf Hitler is finished, perhaps already dead, perhaps only 2 days from death, and asks for a meeting with General Dwight D. Eisenhower so he can surrender the Western Front himself. The man who built the SS state is now talking as if he is already Germany's next ruler. So here is the question. Was this only a panic move by a cornered criminal, or had part of the SS already begun to think about removing Hitler and putting Himmler in his place? The answer is awkward, messy, and very much worth our time. Because if you grew up on the old History Channel the way many of us did, you were taught to think of the Nazi state as a machine that held together until the bunker doors closed. It didn't. By the last months of the war, the machine was shaking itself apart. Senior army officers had already tried to kill Hitler in July 1944. By spring 1945, evidence from post-war interrogations suggests that men inside the SS, of all places, were also discussing a post-Hitler government. Not a democratic one, of course. Nothing noble here. Just a hard, ugly power struggle inside a collapsing dictatorship. And I want to be careful right at the start. We do not have a neat signed order that says the SS will kill Hitler on such and such a date. We don't. What we do have are British interrogation reports, diplomatic telegrams, memoirs, and the testimony of men who had every reason to shade the truth after the war. That means this story is real, but parts of it remain disputed. In my view, the evidence points clearly to an SS effort to replace Hitler. The murder part is harder to prove on paper. The intent to remove him, though, that is much easier to see. If you enjoy this kind of deep file work on the war's forgotten corners, I cover a new case like this every week. Subscribe if that sounds worthwhile. To understand why this mattered, you have to start with a basic contradiction. Himmler had immense institutional power. He controlled the SS, the police, the security apparatus, and by 1945 he stood at the center of one of the largest systems of organized murder in history. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is blunt on this point. Himmler oversaw the concentration camp system and was the senior Nazi official responsible for implementing the final solution. He was no mere courtier. He was one of the regime's principal pillars. So why had he never moved openly against Hitler before? Partly fear, partly habit, partly because dictatorships train ambitious men to kneel so long that when their moment comes, they can't stand up. And Himmler, for all his power, had a streak of hesitation in him that shows up again and again. By early 1945, the military situation had turned hopeless. In the West, Allied armies were pressing toward the Rhine. In the East, the Red Army was breaking into Germany with terrible force. Hitler then made one of his usual late-war mistakes. He handed major military commands to men who had no business holding them. Himmler got command of Army Group Vistula. It was a disaster. He lacked real field command experience, lacked a proper staff, and failed badly enough to damage his standing with Hitler. That failure matters, because after it, Himmler seems to have stopped thinking only as a servant and started thinking, cautiously, indirectly, almost sheepishly, about succession. That is where the first serious thread appears. According to a National Archives summary of Otto Ohlendorf's British interrogation, senior SS men including Felix Steiner, Richard Hildebrandt, and Ohlendorf himself discussed forming a new government in April 1945 that could seek a separate peace with the Western Allies. Their hope was that Himmler would lead it and Hitler would be pushed aside if necessary. Ohlendorf later described the idea with chilling clarity. Our aim was not to put up any resistance, but to let the Allies advance as far as the Elbe, while Germany kept fighting in the East. He added that these men still thought they had a sporting chance against the East. Read that twice, even in collapse. They were still gaming out a deal that might save themselves and leave the Soviets to carry the bloodiest part of the war. That tells us three things. First, this was not a moral revolt. No one in this circle had suddenly become decent. Second, the conspiracy, if we call it that, came from men trying to save what they could of Germany, and themselves, from total ruin. Third, they needed Himmler. Without him, all they had was talk in rooms full of uniforms and cigarette smoke. Now, one of the men who tried to push Himmler into action was not from the SS inner circle at all, but from the Army High Command, Heinz Guderian. Guderian had been trying to get Hitler to face reality. In March 1945, he approached leading figures about making peace in the West. He got nowhere. Then he turned to Himmler, one of the few men in the regime who still had contacts through neutral channels. In his memoir Panzer Leader, Guderian recalled pressing Himmler to go with him to Hitler and demand an armistice. Himmler's reply, as Guderian remembered it, was simple. It was too early for such a step. Too early. In March 1945. When German cities were rubble and Soviet artillery was edging toward Berlin. That was Himmler in a sentence. He knew damn well the war was lost, but he still could not bring himself to move first. And there's the irony. The man who ran a police empire could not arrest his own caution. I think that matters more than people realize. Many powerful men can scheme. Fewer can act. Himmler belonged in the first category. Another thread ran through Walter Schellenberg, Himmler's foreign intelligence chief, clever, slippery, and very much a survivor by instinct. Schellenberg helped open channels to Count Folke Bernadotte in Sweden. By late April, those contacts had become serious enough that the US State Department was receiving reports from Stockholm almost in real time. Bernadotte reported that Himmler wanted to surrender the entire Western Front, including the Netherlands, and hoped that Anglo-American forces would move into northern Germany before the Soviets did. He also reported something even more striking. Himmler still hoped to keep fighting in the East for a time. Bernadotte rejected that at once. The Allies were not going to split the war in two for Himmler's convenience. That episode alone tells you the shape of the SS endgame. This was not about peace in any broad human sense. It was about choosing the enemy you preferred, and choosing the court you hoped might judge you less harshly. And then comes one of those details that sounds like it wandered in from a political thriller. Except it came from the memoirs and interrogations of the men who were there. On April 13th, according to Albert Speer's memoir, Hans Kammler, yes, that Hans Kammler, the SS general tied to the V-weapons program and concentration camp construction, hinted that efforts were underway inside the SS to get rid of Hitler. Speer's memoir is not Holy Writ, and he shaped his own post-war image every chance he got, so take that with a pinch of salt. But Speer had no need to invent an anti-Hitler murmur inside the SS out of thin air. It fits too neatly with what Ohlendorf later said. Different witnesses, different motives, same basic picture. By mid-April, men close to the regime's core were looking beyond Hitler. Actually, let me correct that slightly. They weren't looking beyond Hitler in the sense of building a new Germany. They were looking beyond Hitler in the sense of saving their own positions before the roof came in. That is a very different thing. There was also the question of Hitler's health. Schellenberg told Bernadotte that Hitler was gravely ill. Some around Himmler believed Parkinson's disease explained the Führer's shaking and decline. Historians still debate the diagnosis, and we should be honest about that. The records do not settle it cleanly, but whether the illness was Parkinson's, severe stress, or a cluster of conditions almost matters less than this. By April 1945, many in the Nazi elite thought Hitler was physically and mentally failing in plain sight. That belief changed the math. If Hitler was dying anyway, then removing him looked less like treason and more like inheritance, at least in their own minds. Which brings us to Felix Steiner. You'll know the name from that famous bunker scene in Downfall, the one many people know through parody before they know the history. But Steiner was no joke to the men around Hitler. He had commanded Waffen-SS troops in hard fighting for years. By spring 1945, he was one of the officers tied by Ohlendorf to discussions of a new government. When Hitler ordered Steiner to attack and relieve Berlin, the attack never came. The usual explanation is straightforward enough. Steiner lacked the troops, armor, and fuel to do what Hitler demanded. That is true. But was that the whole truth? I'm not sure it was, because if Steiner was already involved in talk of replacing Hitler, then refusing an impossible order did more than reflect military reality. It also left Hitler isolated in Berlin, exactly where any post-Hitler scenario required him to be, trapped, irrelevant, and very likely dead before long. That is one of those places where the paper trail stops just short of certainty. Frustrating, isn't it? History does that. It leaves you staring at the shape of a thing without handing you the thing itself. Meanwhile, Himmler kept edging toward the throne without ever quite putting his foot on the first step. The most revealing proof came after Hitler's military world had almost collapsed. On April 23rd and 24th, Bernadotte met with the Himmler-Schellenberg circle as they tried to broker a surrender in the West. The State Department record says Himmler told Bernadotte that Hitler was so ill he might already be dead, and that because Hitler was now finished, he, Himmler, had full authority to act. That is a stunning phrase. Not loyalty, not obedience, authority. Himmler was talking like a successor before the succession existed, and he wasn't just improvising in one conversation. The same record shows he wanted to meet Eisenhower personally, not simply send surrender orders through normal channels. That tells me he was trying to do more than end fighting in the West. He was trying to present himself as the man who could still deliver Germany intact enough to be useful. He was selling himself. Some men sell used cars. Himmler was trying to sell himself as Europe's necessary policeman, and yes, that sounds deranged now. It sounded deranged then too. Then Hitler learned about the Bernadotte approach. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that news of Himmler's offer reached Hitler in encircled Berlin on the night of April 28th to 29th. In one of his final political acts, Hitler stripped Himmler of his offices and ordered his arrest. Martin Bormann, always ruthless and always alert to a rival, seized the chance to finish him. That part is often overlooked. Bormann did not create Himmler's betrayal, but he made very sure Hitler saw it in the worst possible light. Now the story becomes almost Shakespearean, except the men involved had far more blood on their hands. On April 30th, Hitler killed himself in Berlin. In his political testament, he did not choose Himmler as successor. He chose Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as Reich President. According to the National World War II Museum, Dönitz later claimed Hitler saw him as a reasonable man with an honest reputation as a sailor who might make a decent peace. That says a lot about Hitler's final mindset. Even at the end, he trusted the Navy man more than the head of the SS Empire. Picture the scene that followed. It is late. The Reich is dying by the hour. Himmler arrives to see Dönitz, still carrying himself like a man who expects power to fall into his lap. Dönitz hands him the message naming the new successor, and then comes one of the most revealing lines in the whole story. As later recounted in American Heritage, Himmler bowed and said, "Allow me to become the second man in your state, not leader, not partner, second man." That is the sound of a failed coup shrinking into a job application. I do not think you can understand the last week of the Third Reich without that moment. It tells you what Himmler had expected. He had expected, at minimum, a place at the center. He had expected the system to need him. He had probably figured that, with Göring disgraced and Hitler dead, the path would open. Instead, Dönitz shut the door. And notice something else here. Himmler did not call out loyal SS units. He did not storm Flensburg. He did not try to seize the radio stations and declare himself the lawful heir. Why not? Because by then his power was partly real and partly theater. The terror state still existed on paper. The war state was collapsing, in fact. And the one thing Himmler had never truly mastered was the decisive leap. That, in my view, is the heart of the matter. The secret SS plot failed not because its men lacked motive, but because the one man they wanted at the top lacked nerve. Still, I don't want to let the others off the hook. Men like Ohlendorf, Steiner, Hildebrandt, and Schellenberg were not passive observers. Ohlendorf's post-war account places them in discussions about pushing Hitler aside for a Western deal. Schellenberg worked the Bernadotte channel. Steiner did not save Berlin. These were actions, not just opinions. If you are looking for a typed order titled "Kill Hitler," you will probably keep looking. If you are looking for a last-ditch SS effort to outlive Hitler and inherit what remained, the record is already sitting in front of you. One tangential detail, because it says a lot about the madness of those final days. Even after all this, Himmler still imagined himself useful to the victors. Ohlendorf later said, Himmler hoped to become the Allies' confidence man in Europe. Think about that phrase. This was the architect of a police empire, one of the central men of the Holocaust, imagining that the Western powers might keep him on as a kind of anti-Bolshevik caretaker. Not just self-deception, imperial self-deception right to the end. That should chill you more than any bunker myth, because it reminds us that many of these men never really believed they were beaten in a moral sense, only in a military one. And here is the final twist. After Dönitz rejected him, Himmler still wasn't done bargaining. The National Archives summary of Ohlendorf's interrogation says that on May 9, 1945, after Germany's surrender in the Northwest and after Hitler was dead, Himmler sent a personal letter to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Ohlendorf even claimed he softened the wording because Himmler's original text was, in his words, unfortunately worded. So even after the plot had failed, even after the succession had passed him by, Himmler kept reaching for one more arrangement, one more role, one more way to stay in the game. That is the image I'd leave you with, not the all-powerful black uniformed enforcer from propaganda photographs, but a diminished man in the wreckage, sending letters no one needed, chasing answers that never came, still convinced history might make room for him. If you want the next part of that story, the final days after Dönitz cast him aside, the last disguises, the last delusions, and the cyanide capsule on May 23rd, subscribe and stay with me. This is Obscure WWII Chronicles. Until next time.